Hi, welcome to this second clip of this week's lecture on agency and power, where we're looking, as I was saying in the first clip, at the kind of pushback at these over-determining, overbearing structures that so many theorists have been emphasizing, as we've seen in the lecture so far, and looking at approaches that really embrace the individual as a source of freedom, autonomy, agency, capacity to resist, to navigate all those structures and rules that we've been looking at in their own way. So that's really the core agenda for this week. And speaking of core agendas, let me convey to you really the core idea of the approach that we're discussing. So I've made here my usual kind of overdrive in diagrams, but just really to illustrate. And I notice that my face is interfering with an important part of the third diagram in the bottom right hand corner. As every week, I encourage you to look at the PowerPoint that's on Moodle to see that little person there that I have, like very similar to the little people. What do they call them? Matchstick persons. That's what's missing there, a matchstick person, similar to the other matchstick people on the other sides of the diagrams. So basically what these diagrams are trying to convey is what I referred to in the earlier clip as the kind of perennial tussle between structure and agency in 20th century, so not that perennial, social theory. The core idea that we're looking at today in thematizing and focusing on agency is that societies and cultures at least involve, or at most consist of, ultimately, people. And people exercise their agency as individuals, i.e. they act on the basis of their own desires and motives, right? So I may live in a society, and that society might furnish me with an array of social facts in terms of which I live my life, I perceive the world around me, and so on. Or I may live in a certain culture, or maybe informed by what I do and what I think may be informed by certain underlying structural codes or distinctions. All of these approaches we've already seen, or indeed certain economic conditions, as in Marxism, all right? But all of this needs to be counteracted with a basic thought that human beings have desires, ideas of their own. They have motives, they have things that they want to do. And those are different from one person to another. They're not exhausted by the societal or the cultural dimensions of their existence, right? So we need a social theory that takes that into account, right? So I've essentially parsed out this idea in terms of parsed with an R, not passed out as in when you pass out because you are exhausted or have had too much to drink. Passed out, as in to pass something out in grammar. I've parsed this idea out in terms of three diagrams. The first one is similar to the diagram that we saw in the first week, in fact, or the second week, where we looked at the concept of society. The second one shows that all of these human beings, they're persons who are subject to social facts, cultural meanings, history, economic relations, structural codes, all of those things that we've looked at. They each have intentions, desires, motives, and they have the power to act, crucially, in terms of their intentions, desires, and motives. They can translate those desires, motives, and intentions into actions that can have an effect on the world, right? Those are the red little arrows. So the motives, intentions, and desires are the blue little cloud bubbles. The idea being that our intentions and our motives somehow are in our heads in some kind of intuitive sense. And that's, of course, a very culturally inflected way of imagining it. But these can be translated into action upon the world. We can make a difference to the world in which we live, right? And so would say the kinds of theories that we're looking at today, those differences that we can make as individual actors can actually have a reciprocal effect back upwards. And that's the third diagram there with a missing bit that you can get on the PowerPoint, the version of the PowerPoint where I'm not kind of talking as a talking head as I am here. These actions can have an effect on the societal, cultural, historical, structural conditions that the theories that we've been looking at so far lay such an emphasis on, right? So there can be a kind of reciprocal, social facts and cultural facts and so on act upon human beings, but human beings can act reciprocally to change them. So there's a kind of circular reciprocity there. And that is the balance of the theory, the balance between structure and agency to which theories that take agency into account aspire. So the idea is not to exclude the claim that human beings are subject to cultural, structural, social, historical conditions, but rather to say that those conditions are not the end-all and be-all. Humans have their own autonomous capacity to act and to make a difference to those structures that underpin them or bear down upon them. So, the core agenda then for anthropologists who have focused on agency and the power of the agent to make a difference is to, in a sense, counter what in the literature is sometimes referred to as the anti-humanism in the theories that emphasize social and cultural constraints upon people, right? So, for example, people often say that Lévi-Strauss was in some ways anti-humanist, right? Not anti-human, but anti-humanist, anti-making a value out of the human, right? Which is very broadly how we might want to define humanism, right? Where humans are valorized in some sense, right? So these theories of agency revalorize the human and counteract the anti-humanism of those structurally oriented approaches, right? They look at people as individuals, i.e. they look at them as agents with wills, desires, motives, projects that have the capacity or the power to make things happen. So agency is viewed as, if you like, a project that human beings engage in. I mean, this concept of a project is very interesting and very contemporary. I think could really be analyzed ethnographically. Everyone has a project these days. But essentially seeing people as being capable of entertaining and implementing projects of their own power, their own autonomy on the world, right? Is what's interesting here. And connected to that is an interest in exploring the potential that human beings have to resist actively the structures to which they are subject, i.e. structures have a power on us, but we also have a reciprocal power upon them. Power goes both ways, according to this approach, right? So therefore, the ultimate objective of these approaches is to develop theories that look at the relationship between structure and agency, as I was saying before, showing how individuals can also change the structures to which they're subject. These are approaches that have been tagged, as we will see, with various bits of theoretical jargon, the idea of methodological individualism, the idea of practice theory that we saw a couple of weeks ago in relation to Bourdieu, right? Bourdieu is a good example of a person who's trying to balance structure and agency in an interesting way, right? So these are the kinds of theoretical approaches that an attempt to balance structure and agency produces. So what are the core questions about agency and power that an anthropologist might be interested in asking? So let's say in any given ethnographic situation, how are individual agents' actions to be understood? So don't just look at it. You may remember when we were discussing Marxism, we said, well, one of the advantages of Marxism for anthropology is that it gives you almost a kind of crude recipe with which to get started when you're doing fieldwork. You just go to wherever you're doing your fieldwork and you start looking at economic relationships. Who owns the resources, who doesn't, and so on. Well, this approach here says, okay, fine, look at these structural conditions or these economic underlying distributions of resources and so on, but look at them in relation to how individual agents' actions are being pursued in each context, right? Ask yourself, in what ways are these agents free or autonomous or otherwise able to make a difference to the structures in which they live? Be sensitive to that, right, in your ethnography. Don't ignore individual flesh and blood persons trying to carve out their own space, their own way of doing things, but really embrace that and make it part of your ethnographic description and your anthropological analysis of that description. In what realms of life do these people realize their personal projects, their reflections, their wills, their desires? What motivates people, and how should we interpret these motivations that they have, right? This question of motivation, as we'll see, is really, really important for these approaches. Are there different ways of conceiving of agency and power in different local contexts? For example, can we think of agency without the idea of freedom? So as ethnographers, as anthropologists, interested in agency and power, we may also be interested in the ways in which the people with whom we're studying may have their own ideas or their own assumptions about what it is to be an agent, what it is to wield power, what it is to pursue your own motivations, your own desires, right? Those concepts are not universal. We can unpack them ethnographically. And this is an interesting way, actually, in which perhaps the point that I made in the earlier clip about the incipient ethnocentrism that I feel is sometimes embedded in these agency-oriented approaches could be combated, could be counteracted by being really ethnographic and saying, okay, we're interested in agency, but even more, we're interested in what the people that we're studying think or assume agency might be. That's a really interesting ethnographic question to ask. If you're interested in agency and freedom, you're also interested in ethics. In anthropology recently, there's been a real flurry of writing about ethics. People like Joel Robbins or Veena Das or James Laidlaw, Webb Keen, a whole bunch of people I can think of, many of them in America, a lot of them in Cambridge for some reason, have been writing about ethics recently. And of course, ethics is immediately important if you're interested in people's personal space for reflection on their own motivations and so on. So if you like, a Durkheimian society-based approach focuses on morality, understood as a societal question, like the norms that constrain us and so on. These approaches that emphasize agency are more interested in ethics, seen as a space of reflexivity and personal freedom that people might have to exercise and reflect. Sorry, I swallowed the wrong way, I think. These moral codes that they are bequeathed by the social and cultural conditions into which they're born. This space for personal ethical reflection, the choices that I might make for myself, given the structures in which I live, are of particular interest to this approach. Finally, the question of how power is to be conceptualized in relation to agency, and indeed how the very concept of a person, or personhood, as anthropologists sometimes say, how that might be conceptualized is also of great interest to anthropologists interested in questions of agency. So the person is the locus of agency, but what counts as a person in any given situation might be different from an anthropological point of view. So that, again, is a way of opening up the question of agency in a way that is anthropological. Okay, so much for this kind of general core idea introduction. In the next clip, we'll look a little bit at the kind of origins of these ideas in the work, particularly of Max Weber, who is massively important for these approaches. See you there.